Last week, it was a U.S. troop pullout and an invitation to the White House. Now, Donald Trump slapping sanctions on Turkey. The U.S. president's surprise decision to withdraw support for Syria's Kurds, taken as a green light at the time by Ankara, which wasted no time crossing the border with the aim of establishing a buffer zone between itself and a group closely allied with its own PKK insurgency. Amid the uproar over abandoning the fighting force that took on ISIS, we're going to make sense of these U.S. sanctions and see whether Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan will pause for thought in the face of not only newfound U.S. pressure, but also arms embargoes from fellow NATO members, and news that Russia, which is emerging as the sole power broker between Ankara and the Kurds, is now putting its weight behind patrols, installing a buffer between the forces of Damascus, which have moved up to the area, and the Turks. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at who stands in Turkey's way. Joining us, Craig Capidis, contributing editor to Quartz. How are you?
Okay, François.
Also joining us, Annick Cizel. She lectures in transatlantic relations at Paris's Sorbonne Nouvelle University.
Good evening.
Welcome back to the show. Welcome back from Pretoria, former Turkish diplomat Sinan Ülgen, who heads the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And from New York, Anton Kozlov, who is a professor at the American Graduate School of Paris. Good to see you.
Hi, how are you?
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Let's start with the latest. Some wonder if 1 week on, the offensive may have just been perhaps stopped in its tracks. In Moscow, the defense ministry reporting that Russian troops have started patrolling front lines between Turkish and Syrian army positions to keep them separated. I know it's an overused expression, but is this a game changer, Craig Capidis?
I think it is. It puts Russia in the driver's seat. Perhaps Mr. Putin will be nominated and win the Nobel Peace Prize. Certainly that's one of the things you're hearing people talking about. I just don't think it's going to last because Russia is not a trustworthy player. I think the mandate, in my opinion, is quite simple. You have to start with all the ways you can possibly parse this. It's the origin story here is that the Kurds, since they lost out at the Treaty of Sèvres after the war, they've been
World War I, we're talking about.
World War I, they've been looking for a homeland. That's a fact. The other fact is, since that time, the Kurds have been the boogeyman of Turkey. And what we're seeing going on here is really, I think, a moral question. The United States went in. Diplomatically, they were hoping to broker some kind of peace a la the Stormont Agreement in Northern Ireland, between the Kurds and the Turks. As Jacques Chirac said, America broke it. America owned it. They had to be there. This was supposed to be the way out. At least that's what the American foreign policy community thought. And now they leave. So the question is, did America have a moral imperative to remain? And I think they should have, but now they're gone. And all of that work is over with.
All that work is over with. So the Russians in the middle, you're saying that may not last?
I don't think it's going to last. The Turks have had, correct me if I'm wrong here, Professor, 10 wars with Russia. They've lost 9 of them. There's no love lost between Russia and Turkey. There's no love lost between the Turks and the Syrians. And what we're seeing on the ground so far is ethnic cleansing of the Turks. Now, I think the Russians would be more than happy to go along with that. I think the whole thing with ISIS, Daesh, the Russians are not going to put Daesh in camps. They're just going to exterminate them. The Russians come in with a kulak. They come in with a fist. And that's what we're going to be seeing there. And I cannot see any substantive negotiations for a brokered peace for some kind of solution to the Kurdistan problem, the Kurd problem, under this current scenario.
Sinan Ülgen, do you agree?
On many accounts, I don't. Let me start with the terminology. Turkey is not at war against Kurds. Turkey is at war against the PKK and the YPG, which is an offshoot of the PKK. That's the reason why the Turkish government had to go in. Regarding the U.S. position, the U.S. did not step in that region just to make, in order to be a facilitator for peace between Turkey and the Kurds in general. It went there to fight the Islamic State, but because of domestic political considerations, it didn't want to put the U.S. troops on the ground, and therefore relied on the PKK to do its own bidding. But that option created a lot of tension between Turkey and the United States, which happened to be two NATO allies, because Turkey considers the PKK as a terrorist entity. And by the way, the US as well, and also so does France. So, and despite that fact, the US decided to use the PKK. And now that the US presence has decided that enough ground has been covered, that the PKK, that the Islamic State has now been made almost dysfunctional, the US can pull back. So, in a nutshell, that's the situation that we're looking at.
But what about these Russian troops that are now in between the forces of Damascus and those of Ankara? Does that mean that the offensive for now is over?
Yes. No, it doesn't. What that signals is that Russia's endgame for the region is for the regime, the Damascus regime, to essentially take over the control of this territory. And when you look in the long-term perspective, that's what needs to happen. The Syrian regime
do you see
has to take over the control
Turkish
of
forces firing on the Russians in northern Syria?
No, I don't. But the Russians are not all over the place. What has happened is that after the agreement between the regime and the YPG, the Syrian Arab army started to move, but essentially towards the urban settlement areas. So far, the Turkish operation has not focused on the urban areas. On the contrary, Turkey's aim was to create a safe corridor, and it has not targeted the urban settlements. So down the road, that might become an issue between Turkey and Russia about how we deal with urban areas. But so far, from the perspective of the operation, that has not hindered the military aspect of the operation.
Anton Kozlov, you agree that it's going to be continued to be full steam ahead for the Turkish offensive, at least for now?
Well, I frankly, I don't know. I think it's important to remember that Turks did fire on Russian troops. They shot down a Russian military jet in 2015,
Correct.
and that led to a pretty serious confrontation, diplomatic confrontation between Russia and Turkey. But I think what is important is that Russia is very happy to see Turkey to get stuck in this region with their offensive, to bring Syrian and Russian troops there, and to make sure that Turkey is it's going to be a semi-frozen conflict, and the Russians are very good at using this kind of conflicts for their political ends. So I think that the Russians are the real beneficiaries of this military operation.
And is it going to be along the lines of what you just heard Sinan Ülgen flesh out, that the Turks will take positions in sparsely populated areas, and for now they'll avoid a head-on confrontation in heavily populated cities?
Well, I think that's probably what's going to happen, because militarily that makes sense. But I think they're not going to advance the way they wanted to advance, because they did have a plan. It's 30 kilometers deep and 480 long. Whether it's going to happen, we're to see. But I think the fact that there is Syrian government troops and the Russian troops, it makes a lot of difference, and it makes a huge change, because the Russians from 2015, they've been playing the Kurdish card against the Turks. And they will continue, because in this particular case, Turks are opposing Russian strategic interests in Syria. So that's what it is.
All right, so, and the story, as reported from Damascus this Tuesday, well, it's got Syrian state television broadcasting images showing a warm welcome for Bashar al-Assad's forces in the Kurdish-held Arab-majority town of Manbij in the north. This, as the U.S.-led coalition in Syria confirms it has pulled out all of its troops from that city. U.S. troops reportedly leaving in these images Monday at the approach to the Kara Kozaj bridge that's on the Euphrates. That's according to Syria's North Press Agency. Do you realize it's only been 1 week, Anik Sizel, since the Turkish operation began?
It seems that an entire set of international relations have been just turning. The tables have been turned on the international world order in just 1 week. Indeed, when we're seeing actually Turkish, like a NATO member, the Turkish military that close to shooting at American troops. And at some stage, we had the Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, saying, wait a minute, we need to pull out our guys now. We need to pull them out, not because President Trump is saying so, because they're caught in the crossfire. We are seeing definitely, I do believe that Russia is here to stay. Russia is not about to, is mediating for its own interest right now, which is a military interest, which is a naval base interest, and it's definitely not ready to leave Syria anytime soon. I mean, they didn't try and broker the Astana peace process for nothing, most definitely. The Turkish gentleman seemed to be believing there was one American foreign policy. And most definitely, we've had within the span of 1 week all the multiple voices of U.S. foreign policy possible, including the Department of Defense, which originally was opposing the withdrawal decided upon by President Trump, by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. We've had the Secretary of State silent most of the week, except until the very final step so far, which is the sanctions that have been decided, for which we learn from the Vice President, and President Trump has finally signed them. I mean, whenever President Trump actually endorses a foreign policy moves, he tweets about it. He's not tweeting about it. He's got his Vice President saying, okay, the President okayed what Mike Pompeo and myself have been proposing, that is sanctions, somehow giving into something to Congress at the same time, and to the bipartisan move by Lindsey Graham and Nancy Pelosi. We're seeing the full spectrum of U.S. foreign policy dissensions somehow over what should be done in Syria. We've heard all of this within the span of 1 week.
And we can add a new wrinkle, which is the announcement that the vice president will be traveling to Turkey to negotiate a ceasefire. That's according to the Trump administration. This announcement coming in the wake of Monday's announcement of sanctions.
The United States of America wants Turkey to stop the invasion, to implement an immediate ceasefire, and to begin to negotiate with Kurdish forces in Syria to bring an end to the violence. President Trump reiterated his offer to mediate and arbitrate a negotiation between Syrian Defense Forces and the Turkish military.
Our desire is not to shut down the Turkish economy. Our desire is to see an appropriate response. These sanctions will be very severe on the Turkish economy. We can continue to ramp up these sanctions. So we were very clear in warning the government of the sanctions.
Continue to ramp up. Sinan Ülgen, should the Turks be worried?
Well, potentially, of course. But compared to what Trump had tweeted about, in terms of the potential impact of the sanctions, what we have seen yesterday was a rather light version of these potential sanctions. But that has to be understood also within the political dynamics of the US, because I think what the administration is trying to do is to preempt Congress from passing a much heavier sanctions bill that would totally disrupt the ongoing dialogue between Turkey and the United States. So right now, with this relatively light sanctions that has been adopted, It is conditional also on a ceasefire. So when there's a ceasefire, these sanctions will be eliminated. And secondly, you mentioned that the Vice President Pence will be visiting the country. Yes, but also there's another critical milestone, and that is the 13th of November, when President Erdogan has been invited to Washington to meet with President Trump. And I think that's really the major deadline.
And for you, that visit is still on.
Where we go in terms of both. Yes, it's absolutely on.
Absolutely on. Craig Kapitis, despite sanctions being announced by Washington.
Well, Vice President Pence's statement is not going to go down well in Ankara because the first word out of his mouth was the word invasion. All Turkish media has been ordered by Ankara to not use that word. They're supposed to use the word liberation or liberators. I want to just, for a moment, refer to this acronym word salad, PKK, PYD, YMCA, YPG. There are the YPG, the People's Protection Unit, who are the fighters, the Kurdish fighters in northern Syria. Some of them in the past, and maybe right now, are connected to what is a terrorist organization, but not all of them. And it is the fig leaf that Ankara has used for years to tar all Kurds as terrorists. There have been arrests over the past week in Turkey of individuals who have protested the liberation. People have been, Kurdish politicians have been arrested for, quote, inciting hatred and enmity and for spreading terrorist propaganda and openly insulting the government. And finally, to show you the depth of President Erdogan's desire here to eliminate the Kurds, shortly after the liberation was announced, he ordered some 90,000 mosques in the country to recite the Quran's conquest surah. That's very heavy manners.
All right, I want to get the rest of the panel to react to that, but we have to take a quick break. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're looking at the fast-moving pieces in northeast Syria 1 week after Turkey launched its offensive across the border against the Kurdish fighters there. We now have Russia stepping in with troops acting as a buffer near the city of Manbij between Syrian government forces that the Kurds have called in and the Turks, and also the U.S. slapping sanctions, sending their vice presidents to Ankara. We're talking about it with Craig Kapitis, contributing editor at Quartz, Annick Cizel, who teaches at Paris' Sorbonne Nouvelle University. Sinan Ülgen is with us from Pretoria, former Turkish diplomat who heads the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies. And from New York, Anton Kozlov, professor at the American Graduate School of Paris. Anton, after Italy, the UK, the latest NATO member to announce a suspension of arms sales to Turkey, I want to get your reaction to what Turkey's president had to say on Monday. This is the Alliance Secretary General, as you saw, visited Boris Johnson at Downing Street. He's been making the rounds. Johnson among the Western leaders who, according to Erdogan, doesn't get it.
On Sunday, I had a meeting with Chancellor Angela Merkel. And the day before, I had another meeting with Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister. In our talks, I saw that unfortunately they do not know the truth and are under serious pressure from disinformation. Of course, I explained the truth to them.
Anton Kozlov, how's NATO doing?
Well, I think it is quite clear that Turkey hasn't been such a great NATO ally. We know that in 2016, during, after the coup, Turkey accused the United States or the American military personnel in Turkey to help out those putschist. So I think the important thing, the Turks can buy weapons, and they've been buying weapons in Russia, and that created certain tensions between Turkey and their NATO allies, the United States in particular. But I think the Turks are playing their own game. It is important to keep in mind that Erdogan certainly is someone who clearly is trying to break with the Turkish tradition of Mustafa Kemal. And when Turkey became a NATO member, has been a long time ago. So now Turkey is playing its own game, and I think the fact that they're trying to muscle their way into Syria and they've been criticizing the United States, that's very telling. So I don't think it's NATO today. It is well, there's certain missions they fulfill, but in reality, if you really analyze the situation, it's not a very functional structure. So in the sense that, let's say, if Turkey is attacked tomorrow, it is, we have I would doubt very much that other NATO allies would go into an all-out war for Turkey. So the Turks are very conscious of that. So.
All right, Sinan Ülgen, you just heard Anton Kozlov say it. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, someone who's broken with the lineage of the founder of the modern Turkish state, Ataturk. Can Erdogan, and it's the question we've been asking all week, can he go it alone?
No, he can't. And I've been one of the analysts who has been critical of what Turkey is trying to do, both domestically and on foreign policy dimensions. But at the same time, we have to understand that today, in terms of mutual trust, there has been a lot of erosion of that important and critical material between Turkey and the United States in particular. There are a number of mutual grievances. One of them we already discussed, the United States support to the PKK-YPG. And by the way, the fig leaf terminology was used a little while ago, and that's a very good terminology, but in essence, it applies to the United States. The United States used the fig leaf of the YPG while it was, in essence, the PKK, knowing full well that it's a terrorist organization. Secondly, the United States has been less than helpful after the coup attempt in terms of investigating the Gülen network in the United States, which is known to have been the architect of the coup. So there are a number of mutual grievances. The US also has grievances in terms of Turkey's attitudes. But fundamentally, this is also what has led us to the situation in Syria, because obviously for Turkey, the situation is far from ideal. Turkey would not have wanted to carry out a cross-border operation if it believed that its own NATO ally would provide the necessary security guarantees in that region. But what Turkey could not accept is a scenario where, with U.S. support, a mini-state that is essentially viewed as a terrorist organization would be created just across the border. That's the scenario that Turkey wanted to prevent. And of course, the second motivation for this operation is to create the conditions that would allow now more than 3.6 million Syrian refugees that are currently hosted by Turkey to start to go home. And here I want to underline, this has to be a voluntary return. Nobody's talking about a forced expulsion. It has to be a voluntary return. But what Turkey tries to do is to create the conditions so that this trend can start. That's been the second motivation for this cross-border operation.
Anik Sizel?
I have the feeling somehow, looking at the sequence of events, that Turkey is trying to counter what the United States has been doing for the past couple of weeks. We've seen some shuttle diplomacy from Mike Pompeo and then Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, who've been following in each other's footsteps, traveling to Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, speeding up the strategic alliance between the three countries, which was launched signed up between Israel, Cyprus, and Greece last March 2019. As the United States is at the same time, and NATO are preparing at the same time, possibly for the admission of North Macedonia into NATO, but at the same time are beefing up US military installations, a naval base in Crete, of Greece. At the same time as discussions are taking place more and more with Cyprus on what type of a forward base for the United States in the region. At the same time as the Washington Post was saying a few hours ago that secret discussions have been taking place within the US military as to shall we pull out the 50-something tactical nuclear weapons which are currently in Incirlik in Turkey on the US military base there. It seems that the United States is just simply preparing for plan B, and possibly because there have been incidents over Syria in recent months, the past year and a half, we may remember how Germany at some stage had to fold back to Jordan because Turkey was just not playing fair with what the authorizations they needed. So it seems definitely the United States is speeding up the plan B. What if we need to isolate Turkey economically, and that's the first part of the sanctions, even though I do agree that the legislation in Congress would have been harsher, but at the same time, militarily speaking, the United States is isolating Turkey more and more. The answer is Turkey saying, we are the regional leaders, we are the pivot, and you're going to have to deal with us in Syria.
Well, let's talk about that point you mentioned there, that Incirlik air base. It's a NATO air base inside of Turkey, one where the U.S. Air Force has 50 B-61 gravity bombs. Those are possibly nuclear weapons. The New York Times, quoting a senior official, saying those bombs are now essentially, quote, Erdogan's hostages. The Times piece saying to fly them out of Incirlik would be to mark the de facto end of the Turkish-American alliance. To keep them there, though, is to perpetuate a nuclear vulnerability that should have been eliminated years ago. Craig Kapitas.
Well, now we're in my wheelhouse. First of all, I would take that 50 number with great suspicion. I would even question whether those nuclear weapons are still in Incirlik. The most secret operations in the United States government have to do with tactical and intercontinental nuclear weapons. The codes, the security around them, it is the highest level of secret. The United States government will not, under any conditions, discuss the details of this weaponry. Now, as I understand it, there are two types of tactical weapons that may or may not still be in Turkey. One of them, indeed, is for the B-52s. The issue is that those weapons, if they were to fall in the wrong hands, would not make dirty bombs. You can't make a dirty bomb out of uranium or plutonium, although plutonium, if they have that component in it, can poison people through airborne. You need medical isotopes or waste from a nuclear reactor to make a dirty bomb. The concern that the United States officials expressed to me, and this was in July of this year when I had this discussion, was the optic of keeping those weapons in Turkey. Is there a fear that someone can go in and take them? Yes, that is actually a fear, but whoever got them, you need more than someone with a degree.
But taking them out, would it be, as that New York Times piece claims, the end of the Turkey-U.S. alliance?
Well, that's the U.S.-Turkey alliance is over with. It has been over for quite some time. Let's put that off the table. I think when you're talking about the nukes, I don't think we really know if they're still there or if they're gone, because the United States is not going to tell you. But if they felt, because they were there during the attempted coup, that weaponry was on the ground. Where they are now, as far as I'm concerned, is a mystery.
All right. Sinan Ülgen, you agree that the Turkish-U.S. alliance is already over?
No, I'm not, but I happen to disagree with the New York Times prognosis that removing those nuclear weapons would spell the end of the alliance. Today, really, there's no there's no real scenario where those weapons are to be used. So there has already been, for years now, an ongoing debate about the fate of the U.S. forward deployed tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. Turkey has been part of that debate. But the removal of those weapons to be placed somewhere else in Europe certainly doesn't spell the end of this alliance. Other things may, But it's not just the removal of those nuclear weapons that's going to be that's going to create
He's right.
that outcome.
I agree.
However, it is certainly
it's optic. It's the optics.
And therefore it is. Yes, I mean, and here, if the U.S. wants to remove them, the U.S. can easily remove them. Turkey has no control over those weapons. These are U.S. forward deployed weapons. They're not even NATO weapons. So I think it boils down to whether Washington wants to go down that path. But ultimately, the U.S.-Turkey alliance is more than about nuclear weapons. There certainly has been tension, especially since the ill-fated U.S. intervention in Iraq. That's really the source of the tension, because from there on, Turkey had to face all the security spillovers of that U.S. intervention. And then, of course, the U.S. agenda in the Middle East, where Turkey's interests have diverged from the U.S. interest. And that's really at the core of where the Washington and Ankara don't see eye to eye. They are, however, much closer, and their views overlap in terms of the territorial defense issues with regard to Europe, with regard to Ukraine, with regard to Russia, and so on. So I think we have to be careful in terms of categorizing it with wholesome categorizations. There are areas where these interests do continue to overlap, and there are others where they're divergent, in particular in the Middle East nowadays.
Anton Kozlov, remember the Cold War, how simple it was? It was East versus West. It was binary. And here you heard Annick Cizel describe all the shuttle diplomacy that's been going on the part of Washington. You heard Sinan Ülgen explaining how Turkey's hedging its bets between all the players there. What's the world going to look like once this campaign is over?
Well, I think, we're dealing with indeed multi-track diplomacy, but I think Turkey in the long term is going to lose in this situation. And Russia is going to win. And the United States, they're already losing their presence and their influence in the Middle East. It's been going for quite a while. But certainly Trump's decision did not help to reestablish America's presence or America's clout in the region. So those who gain, Russia, Iran, perhaps, because Bashar al-Assad is going to stay. And the fact that he's staying, if you remember back in 2011, 2012, everyone except for Russia and Bashar were saying that Bashar has 2-3 weeks to go. And Erdogan was one of the first. So now Bashar is still there. So we're saying that the situation certainly did not play the way the West or Turkey planned. Now, of course, everybody's trying to limit...
But Russia's bogged down as well.
Whatever damage. Excuse me?
But Russia's bogged down as well. Yes, they want to stay in Syria to protect their naval base there, but they have to stay on or else Bashar falls, right?
Well, if they can bring back the system that existed before the war, and Bashar has enough allies now, Iran, you've got Hezbollah and so on and so forth. So they will definitely stay because they didn't participate for nothing. They want to have their presence in the region. They want to be a regional power. But we know that the war, once they were able to eliminate the Islamic State and then to fight off whatever remnants of opposition or radical opposition left in the Idlib region, basically Bashar stayed and keeps his position. So in that sense, Russian in this, whatever, we can say 7-year period, 8-year period, they won, at least for now. Maybe they're going to lose in the long run. I don't know. But at this point, it is the Turks and those
at this point, they're winning.
Bad,
we're running short on time, and I want to ask you about the spillover, not just regionally and geopolitically, but the spillover, you could almost say, of Turkish domestic politics here in Western Europe. We saw it at the Stade de France at the football match, where it's a lot of those cheering for Turkey on Monday evening when they did those military salutes after they scored the equalizer. Are Franco-Turks, and We saw it Monday evening in the western city in Germany of Herne, where there were fights between the Kurdish community and other Turks, between rival Turkish communities. Could we see a spillover of Turkish politics happening in places like France and Germany where there are sizable Turkish communities?
Well, most definitely. I mean, there's a rebalancing that is taking place either towards Europe, towards the European Union, or away from it, and away from it with such a clash at this stage that, yes, it is going to be a little bit of instability at the same time, because it's the question is a tough one in the sense that a lot of the Turkish population, immigrants, whether they be in France or in Germany right now, are assimilated and have been to a large extent not thinking in those terms. It seems that patriotism and nationalism are clashing again, that at the same time as... Okay, go ahead.
No. I'm just saying, I disagree with you, Francois. I don't think the problem is in Europe. The problem is domestically in Turkey. Yeah. Where Tayyip has 3.6 million Syrian refugees who the Turks don't want anymore. He needs to get out of them. They're draining the economy. There are riots against them in the street. He has just raised taxes 45%. If you're making $85,000 in Turkey, now you're paying 40% tax. He's raised taxes between 15 and 25% on everything from tea to gasoline. His currency, the lira, is getting smacked. It's going to get smacked more. A lot of what's going on here, he has to do for domestic reasons.
Yes, but for the Turks who've chosen the European Union, at a time when there was a fat chance that Turkey would join one day on condition and all this. This is quite a change of optics, as you were saying. And most definitely, I can understand their patriotism at a time when Turkey is a regional player again. At the same time as if tomorrow Erdogan was deciding to open the gates to the refugees and actually implement his threat on the European Union to send the Syrian refugees, if he's stuck on the Syrian border, towards the European Union. I'm not sure the Turkish population's immigrants within the European Union would appreciate very much this type of a policy and how they would look within the European Union. So far, I can understand the patriotism at Turkey being great again, as somebody else would be saying. But between patriotism and nationalism are two things. The Turkish football team, I mean, they're an official team representing their country, and they know with Erdogan in power, this is what they're supposed to be doing. Now, this does not represent the Turkish populations who've been assimilated, who are living. I have Turkish students. This is not at all the way they were behaving at school today. So I think we need to be very careful as to what the Turkish populations within the European Union, again, who've made that choice, how they may be reacting, understanding, knowing precisely what is taking place in Syria right now, which is much more complex than just a Turkish-Kurd story history. It's much, much more complex than this.
Much more complex and not a question of good guys and bad guys, Sinan Ülgen.
No, it's definitely not a question of, just good guys and bad guys. I mean, the world doesn't work like that. I fully agree with the previous analysis. And even when you look at Turkey, I mean, Turkey is a country where there are, a multitude of different political movements. Some of them have aligned themselves with President Erdogan. Some others are in the opposition. The opposition happened to win in the municipal elections in Turkey, despite the very heavy pressure. So I think it would be wrong to judge Turkey on the basis of, just the policies that are currently in place. But again, when we talk about Syria, I still have to underline
there's more of a consensus there. Unfortunately, we're running short on time. Sinan Ülgen, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Pretoria. I want to thank Anton Kozlov for being with us from New York City. Craig Kapitas, Anik Sizel, stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, François. I'll start with an article in the New York Times looking at how Russia plans to benefit from what it's calling US missteps. This is by Anton Troyanovsky in Moscow. And he's saying, as the Middle East is reeling from President Trump's decision to erratic foreign policy decision, Russia is savouring a fresh chance to build its status as a resurgent world power and cast itself as a force for stability. He points out in this article that Vladimir Putin landed in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia on Monday, was given sort of the full red carpet treatment as you would expect, armoured limousine, whatnot. He arrived for talks with King Salman and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, focusing on regional security and oil prices. In this article in the New York Times, they also quote the Saudi ambassador to the UK, who says Russia is becoming an important player in the region, whether one likes it or not. The Russians do, to a certain extent, understand the East better than the West does. So this article is kind of looking at how Russia is kind of stepping into that breach. And one image that might illustrate that is on Carl Sharo's Twitter. You can see here this rather surreal, wordplay, surrealism image of the Syrian army and US forces passing by each other outside Kobani. Former foes and enemies on the battlefields, and here they are just driving past each other. As
ships that pass in the night.
Indeed. The landlubber version. And more tweets on this, or more reactions coming through. This is the Pentagon correspondent for foreign policy. This is information that she has just received. The Syrian Democratic Council, which is, of course, the political wing of the SDF, mostly Kurdish, their US representative tells me Turkish-backed forces are attacking Kobani and kidnapping civilians, despite Erdogan's commitment to Trump yesterday that he would not attack the town. So the extent to which this is evolving in a way other than it had been presented by Erdogan is certainly grabbing a lot of attention. This is another Kurdish political journalist who is tweeting on this. He's quoting a friend in Kobani. Trump is lying. If the US is not going to protect the Kurds, they should leave. They have sold us to Turkey. They do not. Do they want us and our children to be killed by the jihadis? And according to this person, Vladimir tweeting what his friend has said, the militia who were attacking are not the Free Syrian Army, they are ISIS. So certainly a very messy picture emerging from those
lots of claims and counterclaims.
Exactly, as to who the profile of these people are. Now, as to Donald Trump's the way in which he cast all of this, it is still being, you can see here, Vice President Mike Pence saying the United States of America did not give a green light to Turkey. That is still sort of the official line. People aren't buying it on social media, François. This is Seth Abrahamson of Newsweek, and he's saying, spoiler, Trump 100% gave a green light to Turkey to invade Syria. Justin Amash here I'm not sure actually which publication, but Turkey is in NATO. Its president is visiting in November. It doesn't invade Syria without the go-ahead. And he essentially is saying that the White House is gaslighting America by feigning ignorance. So no one really believes that the green light wasn't directly given to Recep Tayyip.
It's not an invasion. It's a liberation.
Right. It's all about the semantics. Meanwhile, I don't know if we certainly don't have time to go into this, but a certain amount of comment, François, on that gesture last night on the fields of play here in France, where the Turkish team playing the French side did use a military salute right at the end of that match. So a certain amount of comment on French social media in the last 12, 24 hours about that as well. It was seen as a provocation during what was meant to be a friendly, well, maybe not friendly, but at least a sporting event. So the politics has invaded even the fields of play.
All right, many thanks for that, James Creedon, and we'd like to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.